Good evening, my friends, my brothers, my elders. On September 25th, inside the marble halls of the United Nations, history paused. The General Assembly was in its 80th year, the same pageantry, the same protocols, yet on that day one young man stood at the edge of humiliation. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, was expected to read a confession not written by his hand, a 12-page script drafted in Paris, in Washington, in Tel Aviv. It was meant to break him, to bend him before the watching world. The chamber held its breath. Would he bow his head, accept the chains disguised as diplomacy? Or would he rise, carrying not just his own name, but the memory of a continent that has endured centuries of fire? Imagine the weight. Hundreds of leaders staring, millions watching across the globe, a single file of shame placed before him. But the silence of that hall was heavier than any applause, for in the next moment the question of our time was written on every face. Is this the fall of a young president, or the birth of a symbol? If your ancestors could see that moment, would they call it surrender, or the first breath of freedom? The sun had already set over New York when the delegates filed into the great chamber. The flags of 193 nations lined the walls, a forest of colors meant to symbolize equality. But anyone who had walked those halls long enough knew the truth. Some flags carried weight. Others were little more than decoration. It was in this place, where protocol masked power, that Ibrahim Traoré was summoned to speak. The setting was almost theatrical. Rows of translators behind their glass panels, journalists scribbling as though every word were already history. At the front, a lectern polished by decades of speeches where giants and tyrants alike had stood. Before it laid the document. 12 pages, crisp and official, bearing the insignia of the United Nations. To most eyes, it was nothing unusual. To Traoré, it was a trap. This so-called confession had been drafted not in Ouagadougou, but in foreign capitals, Paris, Washington, Tel Aviv. It accused Burkina Faso of destabilizing its region, of undermining international peace, of obstructing cooperation. It demanded acknowledgement, apology, submission. The logic was clear. If the young president bowed, his rebellion against foreign dictates would collapse. Burkina Faso would return to the fold, chastened and silent. For some in the room, this was the evening's expected climax. Traoré's age alone made him stand out. Barely past his mid-30s, he was among the youngest heads of state to mount that platform. Many doubted his endurance. Some whispered he was reckless. Others predicted he would not last a year in office. And yet here he was, not merely surviving, but standing at the very heart of the world diplomacy. To his critics, this was the moment to break him. To his supporters, it was the chance to prove them wrong. The silence inside the hall was not ordinary silence. It was the hush of anticipation, like the pause before a verdict is read. Western delegations leaned forward, expecting compliance. African delegations sat straighter, hoping for defiance but fearing betrayal. The cameras hovered, feeding live images into homes and offices across the globe. Every gesture, every flicker of his eyes was being studied. Traoré approached the podium with steady steps. His uniform was plain, stripped of medals, a soldier's attire rather than a statesman's robe. He carried no notes of his own, only the file they had placed before him. He adjusted the microphone, the sound echoing faintly in the chamber. For a heartbeat, the entire hall froze. Would he lift the paper, read the words forced upon him? Would he sign his own submission before the watching world? Or would he, could he, discard a script of humiliation and write one of his own? Every president before him had known the weight of compromise, the necessity of diplomacy. But compromise was not what brought Traoré to this stage. He came from a country often dismissed as small, landlocked, irrelevant. Yet Burkina Faso had bled in battles against insurgents, had buried leaders who dared speak of dignity. His very presence at that podium was the continuation of a line traced back through Sankara, through Lumumba, through every African voice silenced before its time. And so he stood, eyes steady, hands firm upon the lectern. The world expected submission. Instead, it was about to hear an indictment. He looked down at the file they had placed before him. For a long second it seemed he might lift it, unfold the confession and let the humiliation play out. Instead, with one deliberate motion he closed it, pressing the pages flat against the wood. The act was quiet, but in that silence the chamber shifted. The defendant had just rejected the prosecutor's script. Then his voice rose, calm at first, then sharper with every phrase. "Let us speak of the first great crime." His words carried not just to the microphones but into the memory of centuries. He spoke of the transatlantic slave trade. 12 million Africans torn from their homes, shackled in iron, forced across oceans. He painted it not as distant history, but as the foundation of Western empires. The wealth of cotton, of sugar, of coffee, built not on labor but on blood. Delegates shifted in their seats. This was not the language of diplomacy. It was indictment. The second crime, he thundered, is financial slavery. He spoke of the CFA franc, a currency still chained to Paris. For decades, African nations were compelled to deposit half of their foreign reserves in the French treasury. "More than $500 billion withheld from our hands," he said, his voice cutting the silence. Some in the French delegation avoided eye contact. For once, the accusation was backed by numbers too precise to dismiss. He turned to Rwanda. The third crime, genocide. 800,000 lives lost in 100 days of fire and machetes. He did not flinch in naming France as protector of those who carried out the killings. The air grew tense. The translators hesitated, the weight of every syllable pressing down on the chamber. "The fourth crime," he continued, "is the debt that strangles us." He cited the crushing numbers. Africa's external debt surpassing $685 billion, nearly $90 billion in repayments due in this very year. "We borrow not to live, but to survive, while our children die not from illness, but from the price of medicine." The words rang out like judgment, the cold arithmetic of exploitation laid bare. Then came agriculture. The fifth crime, the destruction of our fields. He spoke of Ghanaian cocoa farmers ruined by forced liberalization. While Nestlé and Cargill pocketed billions, when our farmers fall, their corporations rise. "The sixth crime," he said, voice steady but unyielding, "is the murder of our leaders. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, 1961. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, 1987. When our leaders spoke of dignity, they were buried, but their voices rise still, through us." He did not pause. The seventh crime, the Cold War. He reminded the hall how dictators like Mobutu were armed while millions starved. We received weapons instead of bread, then oil. The eighth crime, the plundering of Nigeria. He named ExxonMobil, Total. Rivers poisoned, soil toxic. 30 million people condemned to a life expectancy barely reaching 50. The ninth crime, foreign bases. He listed the facts. 29 American military sites, 10 French bases still planted in African soil. They call it stability, but every base is another chain upon our sovereignty. Finally, his voice sharpened to a blade. The 10th crime is the manipulation of human rights. He denounced the selective outrage, Zimbabwe condemned, Sudan sanctioned. Yet Chad and Gabon spared because they serve foreign interests. For them, human rights are not principles. They are weapons. By the time his 10th charge fell into the chamber, the atmosphere had transformed. The hall was no longer a stage for polite speeches. It was a courtroom, and the West stood accused. Yet Traoré was not finished. His eyes swept across the delegations. He called names. Emmanuel Macron, you inherit not merely a presidency but an empire of colonizers. The French delegation stiffened. Donald Trump, you turn trade and oil into bargaining chips bought with blood. You claim greatness, but it is paid with suffering, not your own. American diplomats froze, expressionless. Then he struck at finance itself. To the directors of the International Monetary Fund, you wear the mask of development, but you are wardens of a financial prison. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder, and still his voice carried. We ask no pity. We demand justice. When the last word left his lips, the chamber did not erupt in applause. It did not descend into chaos. Instead, a silence deeper than any roar pressed upon the room. It was the silence of unease, the silence of guilt, the silence of truths that could not be denied. Western delegates avoided one another's eyes. Some scribbled furiously as if notes could shield them from accusation. Others folded their hands, frozen in place. Across the African bloc, shoulders straightened, eyes sharpened. The silence for them was victory. The United Nations itself moved quickly to contain the moment. Within hours, officials announced the speech would not be entered into the official record, citing procedural irregularities. But censorship in the digital age is a sieve. By nightfall, the full transcript had leaked online. Screens lit up in Nairobi and Lagos, in Dakar, in Johannesburg. Students projected his words onto university walls. We ask for no pity. We demand justice. Social media ignited like dry brush-meeting flame. Hashtags bearing Traoré's name surged across Africa, trending not only in French and English, but in Swahili, Yoruba, Wolof, Zulu. Commentators called it the most defiant African address since the age of decolonization. The diaspora echoed the fire. In Paris, young Africans marched past the Eiffel Tower with placards reading, "Traoré speaks for us." In London, chants of "No More Chains" rang through Trafalgar Square. In New York and Washington, African-American leaders spoke of the resonance with their own history, comparing his defiance to the oratory of civil rights preachers. Churches in Atlanta and Detroit read passages from his address aloud as though they were scripture. The ripple spread further still. In Latin America, activists invoked his words against debt traps. In Asia, commentators framed it as proof that the world was no longer unipolar. Even in Europe, among marginalized communities, his speech circulated as forbidden truth, whispered in subways and shared in quiet gatherings. But not all response was celebration. In policy circles from Washington to Brussels, whispers of alarm spread. Analysts warned of a dangerous precedent. If a small landlocked nation could defy the script, others might follow. Could this speech ignite a chorus of voices refusing the language of dependency? Meanwhile, Western media scrambled to shape the narrative. Some outlets dismissed it as theater, the outburst of an inexperienced leader. Others noted its undeniable historical weight, even as they hesitated to fully endorse his claims. Cable news anchors debated late into the night. Was this recklessness, or was it the moral conversation of our time? Through it all, one fact remained unshakable. The speech could not be buried. The silence of the chamber had given way to the noise of the streets, the hum of online platforms, the echo in houses of worship. What began as a carefully staged confession had become a wildfire of defiance. And yet, amid the chants and the hashtags, a deeper question lingered. The world had heard his indictment. But what would come of it? By dawn the next morning, Ibrahim Traoré was no longer merely the president of Burkina Faso. He had become something larger, something uncontained by borders or titles. What had been planned as a humiliating spectacle turned into a transformation so swift that even his enemies struggled to grasp it. Photographs of him leaving the United Nations, the file of Western crimes tucked firmly under his arm, spread across front pages and social media feeds. Commentators compared the image to Mandela raising a fist, to Nkrumah proclaiming independence, to Sankara standing defiantly in his uniform. In one night, a man from a landlocked nation had carved his likeness into the gallery of symbols. The confession was meant to erase his resistance, to paint Burkina Faso as reckless and submissive. Instead, by refusing a single word of it, Traoré had inverted the script. The so-called confession faded into irrelevance. The indictment became immortal. Across Africa, the transformation was palpable. In marketplaces, traders spoke his name as though it carried weight like currency. Taxi drivers in Lagos replayed clips from the speech, the radios crackling with fragments of his voice. In Nairobi, murals of his silhouette began to appear, painted hastily overnight. Each one a declaration. Dignity had found a spokesman. Commentators called it the most defiant African address since the wave of decolonization swept the continent in the mid-20th century. University professors described it as a text that would be studied alongside Fanon and Nkrumah, a modern chapter in the unfinished struggle for sovereignty. Even outside Africa, the symbolism resonated. In Latin America, youth groups cited Traoré as proof that defiance was still possible against towering powers. In Asia, editorials suggested a new multipolar era had gained its first iconic image. And in Europe itself, where politicians tried to ignore him, ordinary people whispered about his courage. For once, the stage of world diplomacy had been turned inside out. A president of one of the poorest nations had stood not as a supplicant, but as prosecutor. The giants of empire, long accustomed to speaking unchallenged, had been forced into the dock of history. It was not applause that crowned his speech, it was the silence, a silence that testified. The charges were too sharp to dismiss, too rooted in memory to erase. That silence became his victory. From that moment on, the question was no longer whether Traoré would be remembered. The question was how his legacy would be carried forward, by whom, and at what cost. In Washington, the speech landed like a stone in still water. The ripples reached think tanks, congressional offices, and the corridors of the State Department within hours. Analysts warned that Traoré's defiance could weaken America's influence in Africa, already strained by rising competition from China and Russia. Congressional aides noted with unease that he had named a former American president directly. To mention Donald Trump by name on that stage, one senior staffer muttered, is not a diplomatic slip. It's a calculated strike. Officially, the State Department avoided confrontation. Its spokesperson offered only a bland reaffirmation of America's commitment to partnership with Africa. But behind closed doors, strategists spoke of dangerous precedent. If Burkina Faso could speak this way, what would stop Ghana, Senegal, or South Africa from following? What if the silence of the chamber turned into a chorus? American media struggled to frame the moment. Some outlets dismissed it as theatrical bluster from a young, untested leader. Others, more cautious, acknowledged the gravity of his historical claims. Cable news channels filled hours of debate. Was he reckless, or was he forcing the world to confront truths long buried? Among older viewers, echoes of the Cold War surfaced, memories of Khrushchev pounding a shoe, of Castro defying the empire in that same hall. To some, it stirred discomfort. Was America again cast as oppressor rather than partner? To others, reluctant respect. At least he had the courage to speak his truth. Across Europe, reactions were fractured. French officials downplayed the accusations, but within their delegation, the visible discomfort had already told its story. In Brussels, diplomats whispered of the danger that African unity might turn rhetoric into policy, perhaps a coordinated demand for reparations, perhaps a collective resistance to debt payments. European newspapers covered the speech cautiously, noting the fire but avoiding the substance. In Africa, however, the response was electric. Leaders who could not applaud in New York now allowed themselves careful words at home. Commentaries praised Traoré as Sankara's heir, the young soldier who had turned the world's courtroom against its former judges. Even those who distrusted his politics admitted that his defiance carried the resonance of a people long silenced. In the global South, the resonance deepened. In Latin America, activists compared his rhetoric to Bolivar's dream of dignity. In Asia, newspapers suggested the speech marked the arrival of a truly multipolar world. Everywhere outside the West, there was recognition. Africa had spoken, and the world had listened, whether it wished to or not. Yet even among admirers, a question lingered like smoke. Was this a new dawn, or the spark of a confrontation yet to come? In the weeks that followed, something remarkable began to stir across Africa. The speech that the United Nations had tried to bury had instead become seed for a movement. Clips of Traoré's words circulated not only online, but in the streets, played from car radios, projected onto public walls, chanted in marketplaces. In Ghana, cocoa farmers repeated his line, "When our farmers fall, their corporations rise." In Senegal, students painted murals of his silhouette with the words, "No pity, justice." The phrase that struck deepest was his vision of a union of black gold. At first, it was dismissed as metaphor, but soon it took on a life of its own. Commentators interpreted it not merely as oil or minerals, but as the wealth of Africa's people, their culture, their resilience. Within a month, hashtags bearing the phrase trended in dozens of languages. At rallies from Lagos to Lusaka, banners declared it as both prophecy and promise, a continent ready to redefine itself. Inside parliaments and ministries, politicians who had once hesitated began to speak more boldly. Economists debated whether African states could renegotiate debt collectively. Some proposed establishing a common front against exploitative contracts with foreign corporations. Others suggested a Pan-African investment fund to replace reliance on external creditors. While no government yet moved formally, the air was thick with possibility. Among ordinary people, the sense of awakening was even more powerful. In refugee camps, aid workers heard children chanting his words as though they were a song. In villages, elders recalled the memory of leaders like Lumumba and Sankara, now seeing Traoré as heir to their unfinished work. They killed Sankara. One man in Ouagadougou was quoted saying, "But his spirit returned with Traoré." The diaspora carried the torch, too. In Paris, London, and New York, young Africans marched with placards reading, "Black gold is us." In Harlem, community leaders wove his defiance into sermons, telling congregations that Africa's dignity was inseparable from their own. Across the Atlantic, the African American press called him a reminder that freedom is never given. It is claimed. For the first time in decades, Africa was not on the defensive. The West was. Diplomats who had long controlled the script found themselves questioned in ways they had not anticipated. At conferences, at trade talks, African delegates invoked his words like a shield, refusing to bend to familiar language of aid and stability. Traoré had given them a vocabulary of defiance, and once spoken, it could not be unsaid. And yet, with the new pride came new danger. Western media warned that Burkina Faso was becoming a rallying point for anti-Western sentiment. Intelligence analysts muttered about instability, about the risk of retaliation. Inside Africa itself, some leaders grew uneasy. Was Traoré a unifying figure or a threat to their own legitimacy? Still, the feeling on the ground could not be erased. In every continent where his words traveled, they carried more than grievance. They carried dignity. They carried memory. They carried a sense that Africa was no longer merely reacting to history, but beginning to write it anew. But with every movement comes a test. Would the union of black gold rise into reality? Or would it meet the fate of Sankara's dream, snuffed out by bullets before it could become law? The question that now hovered over every capital was simple. What comes next? For some, the speech was a dawn, the opening of a chapter long awaited. If the union of black gold could move from slogan to strategy, Africa might finally wield its collective weight. Imagine 54 nations negotiating not as fragments but as one, demanding fair trade, refusing debt servitude, setting terms for their own resources. Such a bloc could shift the balance of wealth and power as profoundly as OPEC once did with oil, but others feared the darker road. Traoré's defiance had earned him admiration, but also enemies. Western powers rarely accept humiliation without response. Whispers spread of sanctions, of financial pressure, even of plots to remove him by force. The ghosts of Lumumba and Sankara lingered in every discussion, reminders that courage alone does not guarantee survival. Within Africa, too, the test was not simple. Pride could unify, but it could also divide. Some leaders welcomed the wave of dignity. Others feared that Traoré's flame might ignite fires they could not control. To them, his speech was not only a challenge to the West, it was a challenge to every African government unwilling to break the old chains. The world now stood at a threshold. Was this the rise of a new order where small nations dared to confront the giants and reshape the conversation? Or was it the prelude to retaliation, a cycle of suppression that would claim yet another young leader's life? One truth remained. After September the 25th, the world could no longer pretend Africa would sit silently. Whether in triumph or in tragedy, Ibrahim Traoré had made sure of that. History rarely announces its turning points. They arrive disguised as ordinary moments, only later revealed as fire. On September 25th, inside the United Nations, a small nation forced the world to look at itself in the mirror. What was meant to be a confession became a charge sheet. What was meant to be humiliation became defiance. Traoré's closing words echo like steel. We did not ask permission to be free. We stood up to claim it. In those words live the lessons of dignity, memory, courage, and identity. Dignity, that true strength, comes not from recognition but from refusing to bow. Memory, that the past is not erased, it breathes through generations. Courage, that one honest voice can carry farther than 1,000 empty declarations. Identity, that freedom begins the moment we stop imitating and start embracing who we are. Some called the speech rumor, others swore it truth. The United Nations chose not to publish it. Yet, whether fact or fable, it spread as history itself, because history is not only what is recorded in documents, it is also what burns in memory, what circulates in whispers, what marches in the streets. The question then is not whether Ibrahim Traoré spoke those words. The question is what we will do with them. Will we let them pass as a headline forgotten by tomorrow's news? Or will we take them as a vow, a reminder that justice cannot wait for permission? To you, the listener, I offer a challenge. In your own life, are you waiting for permission, or are you ready to stand and claim what is right? If his story moved you, leave one word in the comments: justice, or freedom, or simply black gold. Let the world know which flame you carry forward, because freedom is never given. It is seized by those who dare to demand it. The weeks that followed transformed into months, and the momentum that had begun with a single speech continued to build across the African continent like a gathering storm. What had started as scattered reactions, murals here, protests there, coalesced into something more organized, more deliberate, more threatening to the established order. In university lecture halls from Cairo to Cape Town, professors began incorporating Traoré's 10 charges into their curricula. Students analyzed each accusation not just as rhetoric but as documented history. They researched the transatlantic slave trade, studied the mechanics of the CFA franc, examined declassified documents about Western involvement in African conflicts. The educational awakening was profound. A generation that had been taught sanitized versions of colonial history was now confronting the unvarnished truth. Libraries reported unprecedented demand for books on Pan-Africanism, on Lumumba and Sankara, on economic imperialism and neocolonial structures. But knowledge alone was not enough. The movement demanded action. In several African capitals, coordinated demonstrations began calling for specific policy changes. In Dakar, thousands marched demanding withdrawal from the CFA franc zone. In Accra, labor unions organized strikes protesting unfair trade agreements with multinational corporations. In Nairobi, youth groups occupied government buildings, demanding transparency in all contracts with foreign entities. The demonstrations were largely peaceful, but their persistence and coordination unnerved governments across the continent. Some African leaders, inspired by Traoré's example, began taking concrete steps toward economic sovereignty. Others, fearing instability or loss of Western support, cracked down on protesters while publicly praising Traoré's courage, a contradiction that fooled no one. The economic implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Several African nations began renegotiating existing contracts with Western corporations, using Traoré's charges as leverage. Mining companies found themselves facing unexpected demands for profit sharing and environmental restoration. Oil corporations discovered that extraction agreements signed decades earlier were being challenged in African courts. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, mentioned explicitly in Traoré's speech, faced unprecedented scrutiny. Civil society organizations published detailed analyses of loan conditions, revealing patterns that supported his accusations of financial imprisonment. Calls for debt cancellation, once dismissed as unrealistic, gained mainstream traction across the global South. Western financial institutions responded with a mixture of public reassurance and private alarm. Bond ratings for several African nations were adjusted downward, ostensibly due to political uncertainty, but understood by all as punishment for the growing defiance. Yet this backfired. The downgrades were cited as evidence of exactly the kind of financial manipulation Traoré had described. In Washington and Brussels, policy analysts worked frantically to contain what they increasingly referred to as the Traoré effect. Strategic papers circulated among government officials, warning that the speech had fundamentally altered African expectations of international partnerships. Traditional approaches, offering aid conditioned on policy compliance, threatening economic isolation, supporting pliant leaders, were no longer working as reliably as they once had. Some Western politicians called for a more aggressive response. Sanction Burkina Faso, they argued. Make an example of Traoré. Show other African leaders the cost of such defiance. But cooler heads recognized the danger. Turning Traoré into a martyr would only amplify his message and accelerate the very trends they sought to reverse. Instead, a more sophisticated strategy emerged. Western media began running stories about Burkina Faso's internal challenges: poverty, security threats, governance issues. The implicit message: look at the problems Traoré faces at home before listening to his grand speeches at the UN. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts intensified to strengthen relationships with other African leaders, offering new aid packages and favorable trade terms to those who maintained distance from Traoré's rhetoric. But the strategy struggled against a fundamental reality. The speech had articulated grievances that millions of Africans recognized as their own lived experience. No amount of media management or diplomatic maneuvering could erase that recognition. 6 months after the speech, African Union meetings took on a different character. Where once discussions had been dominated by Western-mediated frameworks for development and security, now delegates spoke more openly about collective bargaining power, about renegotiating relationships from positions of strength rather than supplication. A proposal emerged for a continental trade negotiating bloc that would present unified terms to external partners. Another called for coordinated mining policies that would prevent corporations from playing African nations against each other. A third suggested a Pan-African development bank that could provide alternatives to IMF and World Bank financing. None of these proposals were immediately adopted. The African Union remained a body where unity was aspirational rather than actual. But the fact that such ideas were being seriously debated marked a shift that Traoré's speech had catalyzed. The personal cost to Traoré himself was becoming evident. Intelligence reports indicated at least 3 serious assassination plots, foiled only through vigilance and international pressure that made such actions politically costly. His movements were increasingly restricted, his public appearances carefully secured. The price of becoming a symbol was the loss of ordinary freedom. Yet he continued to speak. In interviews, in addresses to his own parliament, in carefully recorded messages distributed online, he reinforced the themes from his UN speech. He emphasized that the movement was not about hating the West, but about claiming African dignity. Not about isolation, but about partnership on equal terms. Not about revenge, but about justice. His rhetoric evolved beyond pure confrontation toward constructive vision. He spoke of the Africa that could be, educated, prosperous, sovereign, contributing to global civilization not as a resource reservoir, but as an equal participant. He painted pictures of African cities leading in technology and innovation, African universities producing world-class research, African artists and thinkers shaping global culture. This positive vision proved as powerful as the original indictment. Young Africans began to imagine futures beyond the limited options that had always been presented to them, either migrate to the West for opportunity or remain in Africa in poverty. Perhaps there was a third option: build the Africa that Traoré envisioned. Entrepreneurship surged across the continent. Startups focused on solving African problems with African solutions multiplied. Tech hubs in Lagos, Nairobi, and Kigali reported unprecedented growth. African investors, including diaspora entrepreneurs, began directing capital toward these ventures rather than defaulting to Western markets. The cultural impact was equally significant. African artists began producing works that explicitly engaged with themes of sovereignty and dignity. Musicians wrote songs referencing the speech. Filmmakers created documentaries exploring the 10 charges. Writers published novels imagining African futures free from neo-colonial constraints. This cultural production reached global audiences through digital platforms that bypassed traditional Western media gatekeeping. For the first time in generations, African narratives about African experiences were reaching mass audiences without Western mediation or sanitization. In Europe and North America, the African diaspora was galvanized. Second- and third-generation immigrants who had grown up navigating complex relationships with their heritage found new pride and purpose. Student organizations at Western universities became more vocal about African issues. Diaspora investment in African ventures increased dramatically. 1 year after the speech, Traoré was invited to address a gathering of African diaspora leaders in Atlanta. The venue was filled beyond capacity, with thousands more watching via live stream. His message was direct. The African continent and its diaspora needed each other. Economic resources, technical expertise, and political influence existed within diaspora communities that could be mobilized for African development. But this required trust, reciprocity, and shared commitment to the vision of African flourishing. The response was overwhelming. Diaspora organizations announced major investment initiatives. Professional associations committed to skills transfer programs. Artists and intellectuals pledged to center African perspectives in their work. The speech at the UN had created permission for the diaspora to embrace their heritage not as a source of shame or exotic identity, but as a foundation for political and economic engagement. Yet shadows remained. Western intelligence agencies continued monitoring Traoré closely. Reports of destabilization efforts, funding for opposition groups, support for separatist movements, economic sabotage, circulated regularly. The pattern was familiar from earlier decades when other African leaders had challenged Western hegemony. Traoré addressed these threats publicly, arguing that transparency was his best defense. By openly discussing the pressure and plots, he made it politically costly for Western powers to act. International attention, he understood, was his shield. As long as the world was watching, the old methods of quiet elimination were more difficult to deploy. The question remained, would this be enough? History offered sobering examples of leaders who had thought international attention would protect them, only to fall victim to forces that operated beyond public view. But history also showed that movements could survive the loss of individual leaders if the ideas had taken root deeply enough. As the second anniversary of the speech approached, it became clear that Traoré's words had indeed planted seeds that would grow regardless of his personal fate. The 10 charges were now common knowledge across Africa and the global South. "We ask no pity, we demand justice," had become a rallying cry that transcended any single leader. The union of black gold remained aspirational, but the aspiration itself was changing how millions of people thought about Africa's place in the world. In quiet conversations among Western policymakers, a reluctant recognition emerged. The world that had existed before September 25th could not be restored. Africa, or at least significant portions of Africa, would need to be engaged differently. The old assumptions of perpetual subordination were no longer tenable. The only question was whether this transition would be managed peacefully through negotiated partnerships, or whether it would require continued confrontation and conflict. For Traoré, sitting in his modest office in Ouagadougou, the path forward remained uncertain, but the direction was clear. He had spoken truth to power and survived long enough to see the truth take root. Whether he would live to see the full harvest was unknown, but the seeds were planted, the soil was fertile, and the season of growth had begun. The speech that was meant to humiliate had instead illuminated. The confession that was drafted to break him had broken something else entirely. The illusion that Africa's subordination was natural, inevitable, or permanent. That illusion, once shattered, could never be fully restored. And in its absence, new possibilities emerged for a continent that had waited centuries for this moment of collective awakening.